And welcome to The Sensational Life with Bibic. I'm Abby.
And I'm Natalie.
And we are developmental therapists at Bibic.
Each week we're going to dive into the many layers of life with honesty, heart and a little bit of humour, because let's face it, navigating the world with additional needs can be tough, but it also can be empowering, inspiring and yes, a little bit sensational.
Bibic is a national charity that supports many individuals with neurological or developmental challenges, and this podcast is our way of bringing support, tips and real stories straight to you.
This season we're talking all things education, from navigating the classroom with confidence, discovering learning strategies, we're unpacking it all with some great guests too. So whether you're a parent, a teacher or someone that just wants to better understand how to support the SEND community, you're in the right place.
So grab a cuppa, get comfy and let's make the world a little more inclusive, one episode at a time. Hello, welcome back to another episode of The Sensational Life with Bibic. We have a really interesting episode today. We are going to be talking about EHCPs with Lauren and Esther from Irwin Mitchell. And on top of that, in our studio, it's a bit of a big word, studio, isn't it? In our studio, we're professionals, Natalie. In our studio, we have got one of our student placements that's come in for Bibic, Ellie. Do you want to say hello, Ellie?
Hi.
You're famous now, you're on a podcast.
Yeah. My claim to fame.
Your claim to fame. And hello to Esther and Lauren as well. How are you guys this morning?
Morning all.
Very well, thank you.
Would you like to tell our listeners a little bit about yourselves and what your role is at Irwin Mitchell?
So I'm a legal director at Irwin Mitchell. I head up the education team nationally, and I also look after the public law and human rights team from our Gatwick and Brighton offices. We do all sorts of educational, really pretty much anything with an education flavour, but we're particularly enthusiastic about cases involving special education needs. So we do all sorts of education healthcare plan or EHCP tribunal appeals, whether it's getting extra provision for EHCPs, or we do disability discrimination act cases, and we also do judicial reviews with an education element. But really, there's much more that we do that's education related, and I'll let Lauren tell you a bit about what we get up to as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I am Lauren. I'm a solicitor in the education team working alongside Esther. As Esther says, we as a team cover pretty much any kind of legal issue you might expect to face in the context of education. Our bread and butter is EHCPs, and both advice and, as Esther says, assisting parents with tribunal appeals regarding EHCPs and decisions related to them. We also advise on admissions appeals for pupils that don't have EHCPs. We advise on exclusions, both for children with SCN and without. And we all in the team come from slightly different backgrounds, don't we, Esther? So for example, before I qualified and started working in education, I assisted a professional deputy in a court of protection sort of context. So I have a lot of experience working with particularly children with quite complex needs, disabilities, and with quite extensive teams of professionals working around them. So it's helpful in the context of education, where we often find a lot of our clients have, treating therapists already involved sometimes, or sometimes even other lawyers who are involved to help with other things. So yeah, keeps us busy, doesn't it, Esther?
I'm already. I was here. I know I said it before, but I was here. I was like, I'm so in awe of these two people from the office. That sounds amazing. Like the background and everything like that. I can imagine you've had some really interesting cases, and especially with a lot of, because I think that's what we're going to touch on as well. A lot of the changes and things like that that's come in. The knowledge you both have.
It's also lovely that we get to see families at pretty much every stage of this process. So we sometimes start working with families right at the outset when they are really at those early stages of thinking, oh, does my child need an EHCP? Should we begin this journey of trying to secure that kind of support for them? All the way down to, young people who are perhaps entering into post-19 support and have had EHCPs in place for years and years, but are transitioning onto that next stage with that view towards moving into adulthood. So Yeah, we've helped at pretty much every aspect of this process you can expect.
Sometimes on multiple tribunals for the same child, which I would say is you would hope it was rare, but it certainly does happen.
We've started launching into talking about EHCPs. Can you describe to our listeners, like, what actually is an EHCP and, like, when might it be used?
So I think an EHCP, it's important, really, the most important thing about it to understand is that it's a legally enforceable document, and it details education, health and social care provision for a child or young person, really from the time it is issued all the way up to the time it ceased or stopped, and it can be in place for the child really from birth all the way up to the age of 25. It's important to understand that the provision in an EHCP should be bespoke to that child or young person, and it shouldn't be kind of generalised or unspecific. And also, it's quite difficult to get one, which we will talk about in due course.
It's interesting that you say that. Like, I mean, I come from a teaching background, and you hear EHCPs mentioned within the education system, and your immediate thought is to go to what's to support with education, like, and that, children who are struggling to access the curriculum and things like that. But you said that it touches on, like, social elements and things like that, and that might be a lesser known element of the EHCP.
Absolutely. And as Esther says, so it's meant to encompass education, health and social care needs. And when EHCPs were first brought in back in 2014, so over 10 years ago now, the purpose of them was to try and bring all of those services together and have a single document that is a bit more all-encompassing, rather than having these departments working in silos and no one really having a proper overview of the full extent of a child or young person's needs. It's important to bear in mind, though, that an EHCP, although it is supposed to cover all of these things, should still be viewing everything through the prism of education. Education is going to be the leading area that these plans will cover. So you might find that there are some children or young people who have health needs or social care needs that might not be mentioned in as much detail in an EHCP as their educational needs are. That's not unusual, but it's certainly also not right to have health and social care needs completely omitted from these documents. It is supposed to bring everyone together.
Yes.
You can also, if your needs are predominantly health related, it might be arguable that you don't need an education and healthcare plan, that you might just need a healthcare plan. So, if you've got allergies, for instance, and you're attending school, you may just need a healthcare plan to deal with that. What happens if you have an allergic reaction, and what's the medication, who do you need to call, and so on. That could actually be dealt with, not for every child, because it of course it can have knock-on effects or impact on the child and their learning, but sometimes it can be quite discreet. And I would also like to say that I think the intention was to join up the services and have this wonderful joined approach. I wouldn't say we're absolutely there yet. I don't know what you think, Lauren.
I totally agree. I think that's one of the biggest criticisms that we see of this system as a whole, is that the intention was, as you say, to bring everyone together, but the reality is that often that isn't happening. And that can leave parents feeling even more frustrated by the whole process.
And it's a little bit of a curveball question, but I feel like with EHCPs, it's such a hard thing to know when you should apply for an EHCP, or do I need an EHCP? And is there like anything or any like specific guidelines? It's at what point does a child need EHCP? Because I feel like a lot of people, especially if their child has SEND or they're struggling, they think that straight away the child needs an EHCP. Is there like a certain point that you go, actually, this is the criteria that we're meeting and therefore an EHCP is necessary? Or is it that anyone can go for an EHCP and this is why so many go to tribunal? It's just sort of from my knowledge.
Yeah, so there's a legal test that says when someone should be issued with an EHCP. And the primary things to think about are whether the child or young person in question has some kind of special educational needs, so they are struggling to access their learning, and whether they need special educational provision to be put in place for them. So basically support that's over and above what a standard mainstream setting would be able to provide from its own resources. And that's the sticking point that we certainly see a lot of parents facing. We might have parents saying, no, my child does need more support. They're not getting the right level of support in school. And then they might find that their request for an EHC needs assessment, or potentially further down the line, they've had the assessment and they are refused an EHCP on the basis that, well, actually, the local authority says the school, a mainstream school, could provide additional support for this child from its own standard resources, and therefore an EHCP isn't necessary. So I'm certainly, when I'm speaking to parents in that situation, of thinking, oh, are we quite there yet? Is it the right thing to do to apply for an EHCP? The first thing I try and reassure them of is that actually the majority of children with SEN do not have EHCPs, and there is quite a lot of SEN support that schools should be able to put in place to try and help pupils whose needs are perhaps a bit less severe, or they're not impacting their learning to quite the extent that might justify an EHCP being put in place. But the first port of call should always be to speak to your school and the teachers that are working with your child to understand what their understanding is of your child's needs and what support they've already been putting in place for them from their own resources, and what kind of extra help they might be able to add before you start going down the EHC needs assessment route.
I think that's really helpful, because I was just thinking back, we had a episode with Zoe, and she's from a company called the Inclusion Service, and she was saying about going on the school's website, and they do have a document that outlines the SEN provisions they're able to provide within the school at that point. And then I was thinking also, we often talk in our assessments about school. I think schools have to go through a 3-phase trial, don't they? They have to.
It's the plan, do, review.
Yeah, they have to plan something, do it, review it, and I think, do they have to do that 3 times? Am I right in that? Before.
So legally, no, they don't actually. There's no legal requirement for that assess, plan, do, review cycle to have been gone through any number of times to apply for an EHC needs assessment. There are some children for whom their needs are so immediately obvious that they clearly meet the threshold for an EHCP without having to go through that process. In practice, we say,
Lauren, that's a really good point. We act for a lot of children who are unfortunately have suffered some kind of birth injury, and you know, it's if you've had some kind of traumatic brain injury or acquired brain injury, you're just, you know, you're going to need an EHCP, and so there are those sort of scenarios that are obvious. It doesn't mean you're not going to require assessment, but I think that the you know, it might depend on the child. And I also wanted to mention, just to flag up the kind of, I suppose, the key legislation that we're working with. Again, it's the Children and Families Act 2014, and what I say to parents is that when you're asking for an assessment, there's a speculative nature to the wording, which is quite helpful. It's quite a low threshold for seeking an assessment, on the basis that you only have to show that the child may have special education needs, and that they may require special education provision to be made in accordance with a plan. And those words, may, are really vital, because that's your stage 1 test. Do we need an assessment? And yet, you know, it's really helpful if there has been some kind of assessment or evidence gathered to show that. Obviously, with a birth injury child, I think you're going to probably be able to show that from the diagnoses, and what they're able to do or not to do will be instant. But when you get onto that stage 2 test, that's where the differences really kick in, and you go from having to show that they may have SEN, which is, you know, if you've got a diagnosis or 2, that's quite an easy hurdle to meet, and that they may require provision, to it's necessary. The wording then in the legislation says it, you know, that you have to be, you know, it's necessary for special education provision to be made in accordance with a plan. And that's where what Lauren was talking about is the school's usual resources when it's necessary. And this idea of necessity is not really defined, and so it's quite vague and difficult. But what we usually look at is, we look at, well, how much money is being spent on this child, and is it over what is known as really the notional budget for each child with SEN. Has this notional budget in a school. it's about £6,000. And it's been quite topical recently because with some of the changes that the government's looking at bringing in, one of the things they're thinking about is increasing this notional budget. It's been static since 2014, as far as I'm aware. And so, obviously inflation's gone up a little bit since then. So it's probably a good idea that they think about increasing it. And that just comes back to, how are we funding our special education needs in schools? So I think that's what I say to parents. This first stage of your test for requesting an assessment, that's often not that, if your child has SEN, is often not that difficult to show. Doesn't mean you're not going to get a no to assess, but it's the second stage of the test which is often harder to prove, because that's when you get onto the quantification. And I don't know how you find that, Laura. We do a few refusal to assess appeals, and we've definitely, I've certainly done them. Had to do one for my own daughter quite recently, but also I would say I do more refusal to issue appeals than I have done over the years. Is that the same for you, Lauren, as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm finding that one of the things we encounter quite a lot, Esther, I know we talk about this at work a lot, is that we often see local authorities make the mistake of applying that stage 2 test at stage 1. So when a family requests an EHC needs assessment, they get a refusal that says it's not necessary for special educational provision to be put in place for this child. And actually that's not really the right question. It's about, is it like, may this child require special educational provision? So I'm seeing certainly more of the refusal to assess appeals that we are dealing with focus on that point of actually it's the wrong test that's been applied. But yeah, I agree. I'm certainly seeing a lot more refusal to issue appeals, and those tend to be a bit more complex. And that's where the evidence that can be gathered through that assess, plan, do, review cycle can be really integral, because it will show what's already been put in place for the child, as Esther says, what money's already been spent. And if you've got evidence that that's not really helping the child progress, their academic results are not really moving in line with their peers, the gap between their attainment and their peers is widening, that's all very supportive evidence to try and demonstrate that it is necessary for special educational provision to be put in place for that child, and therefore they should have an EHCP.
And a BIBIC assessment, because we can do all of that. I was thinking that, and that makes so much sense. I think it's all wording, isn't it? Because it's the may to the necessary. And like I said, I didn't realise that there was those two parts.
Yeah, the two parts to it. And I think that you've mentioned that the plan do review, while there's not a legal requirement that they have to do it, actually it can be beneficial for those children that you're trying to gain that evidence for, and it can strengthen that application process if you can prove that actually what's in a school can reasonably put into place to support this child is not helping them to progress. Yeah.
And it helps to keep the school involved in the process as well. Like, we see a lot of families that find this process infinitely more stressful if they don't have a school that is supportive of the process they're going down. So, launching straight into an EHC needs assessment request without having a chat with the school first can often leave parents finding that they're coming up against more hurdles, and the process overall is more stressful for them. So going through that assess, plan, do, review cycle can be a really helpful way of just making sure the school's walking alongside you as you take those steps. So yeah, while it's not legally required, we do generally say that it is quite a helpful process to try and go through first.
And I often have a lot of conversations with parents about that, because I feel like some parents feel like they don't want to be like a nuisance to school and keep asking them questions. But I always say, actually, that's what school are there for. And if you can keep track of that communication you have with school. So if you have a conversation with the teacher at the door when you drop your child off and let them know that the child has had a challenging morning, and you just follow that up with an email, they don't necessarily have to reply, but at least you've got documentation that you've been communicating with the school and giving them updates and things like that, and that can help with all of this sort of stuff. It opens that communication to what they can and can't support with.
Something I always flag to parents as well is, I know we've been talking about the statutory test under the Children and Families Act 2014, is that The SEND Code of Practice is another really useful document that's meant to kind of get all the legislation together and provides this really useful guide for schools, for local authorities, working with children with SEND. But the test that's set out in the Code of Practice that is seeking an assessment is actually, it bears very little resemblance to the statutory test, which is not very helpful. And I think we can often end up with unlawful decisions because perhaps we've aligned too closely to the Code of Practice test. And I'm just going to give you some examples of what the Code of Practice test says. It asks really to get evidence of the child or young person's academic attainment, and that's like, have they met their milestones? We're looking at progress. Also the information about the nature, extent and context of the child or young person's SEN. It wants to know the evidence that's already been taken. So that's really exactly what we've just been talking about. What has the school, college, early years provider, what have they been doing? And evidence where progress is made, that it's actually, that's only as the result of a lot of additional intervention and support that's, over and above that's been provided. And also any kind of evidence of physical, emotional, social development and health needs. So again, that's kind of the joining up of the services. And then for a young person or over 18, they'll think about, if they need additional time compared to the majority of kids their own age. So that is all really useful stuff as well. But that is not saying that they may have SEN and may require special education provision to be made in accordance with a plan. So it is useful to look at the Code of Practice, and it's also important to look at the legislation. I get really frustrated with local authorities with we do see the wrong test is applied when you're seeking an assessment at stage 1. That's regularly unlawful. But what really annoys me is that when you get to stage 2, it looks like they are applying the right test and saying, it's not necessary for special education provision to be made in accordance with a plan. The school can do it from their own resources. But do you think they've checked? No, they have not checked. And that is really frustrating. If you haven't taken that exercise to cost up the special education provision, and the only way you can do that is really in communication with the school, as Lauren's been explaining, that close collaborative approach. How much are you spending? How much TA support are you putting in place? But it could also be actually maybe the parents putting tutoring in place. Maybe they have, maybe they've commissioned their own speech language therapist, OT, physio, whatever it is. This all adds up. And I tell you what, it doesn't take very much to get over the SEND notional budget. But I would say hardly ever do I see any kind of costed provision at that stage of the test, either submitted by a local authority or a school, an application. And I think that can be the difference as well. And I know this is one of our questions coming up in terms of who can make an application for an EHCP. Well, parents can make it, parents, carers, I think foster carers, I think even social workers, anyone with that sort of close tie to the child. Schools can make it on the child's behalf. Normally, the parent would be involved. But I think there is a difference that we see in the level of detail that is expected from a school application. So if a school applies, they might have set out actually their costings at that stage if they're putting the application in. And so that's why you need the school's input. And if the school aren't with you, it is problematic. They're not always right though. Lauren, have you had any situations where the school have said no, they don't need it, and it's come out the other way, and actually
I have,
they do,
yeah.
and they do get it?
I absolutely have. Actually, do you know what? I've had 2 cases before that were running at the same time, both for children of around the same age with a similar level of need, similar kind of profile. One had a school that was just completely on it. They really understood what this child was struggling with. They'd picked up on things like the child was masking quite a lot in school. So although it might appear that they're understanding, they're paying attention, actually they're really not engaging and they're just not taking in the information. When they would go home and they would be really dysregulated at home, and parents would raise that with the school took it really seriously. And the document they produced when they requested an EHC needs assessment was incredibly helpful. They went into a lot of detail about the needs they'd observed, the amount of support they put in place, and it ultimately made the process much simpler. The other child, though, had a school that just did not seem to pick up on any of those cues, and they had been quite dismissive of the concerns being raised by mum and dad. They hadn't picked up on a lot of the more subtle ways in which this child's needs were being sort of shown in the classroom, and they were just not supportive. They provided some information, they didn't just flat out refuse to engage, but it was nowhere near as helpful. And it meant that we ended up having to have a much harder battle with the local authority to get the outcome that we knew this child needed. So, yeah, I think it shows the real stark difference in how a school's input can influence the process. And as Esther says, it's not to say that if the school is unsupportive, it closes off this route to parents. It is certainly still possible to get that correct result and get an EHCP, even if the school is not being particularly supportive, but it definitely does make it harder.
I think there's a practical point to who should apply as well. Sorry, I realise I've just jumped
No,
in.
carry on.
And the practical point is schools are busy, your child could be number 5 or number 10 in the queue waiting for an EHCP application. And so sometimes it's not actually a good idea to wait for the school to get round to it if it could be significantly delayed because they are so stretched with their time and resources. So in that scenario, I would say crack on and put the application in yourself. Parents can put a really good application in, and I think we're going to explain what we think you should do in terms of putting a good application in. But schools ones, as I said, are they are quite onerous for the school to make as well. They're huge, lengthy documents, and I think I don't want to say every Senko dread filling them in, but we're not talking about 5-minute job here. We're talking about a really large piece of work. And if it's your child, well, you might have many children, I don't know, but you are going to be able to put that time and effort into your child's application, and you can turn to the school and ask them for a letter of support or something like that. To be honest, you put the application in and then they'll probably be sent another application form by the local authority, but they don't have an option of when to prioritise that. They do have some discretion about prioritising your child's application. So really it's about getting that to the top of the list.
Yeah. And we've talked about different areas of the process, but could you just kind of walk us through the EHCP assessment process, like what it involves from start to finish?
Sure. And actually, it's really important to know that not only is the process pretty regimented legally, but there's very specific timeframes that the law says all of these steps should be completed within. We'll get on to whether that happens in practice in a moment. But so the law says that
I was going to say, everyone needs to get out a notepad now and start writing these down.
Well, and as Esther says, the code of practice is a really good resource to check in on because that is all set out in there as well. So if you miss anything while we're talking, definitely check the code of practice. But yeah, so the assessment process basically begins with the assessment request going into the local authority, which, as Esther says, can be made by parents, by school, or a child can be brought to the attention of the local authority by other professionals that are working with them. Generally, the vast majority we see are submitted by either parents or by school. The process for submitting that request, I've found, varies from local authority to local authority. I've had some local authorities where it's all done through like an online portal and online forms. I've had others where you print off PDF forms and send them all in. But the request will go in to the local authority via whatever mechanism they have in place. So step 1 will be to check your local authority's website, go onto their SEN sort of section, and there should be a step-by-step process in there of how to submit a request for an EHC needs assessment. And that is what kicks off the entire process.
On that issue, I think it's unlawful to prescribe how it should be put in. And I've seen this with other clients before where they say, you've got to use our portal. And then they've got these really loaded questions literally loaded questions. I don't think they're quite right, that they force parents to answer or to go down the route of answering, which actually don't bear that much resemblance to the legal test, and I don't think are very helpful. And so my view is that you don't have to follow their portal. You can just put a letter in. So I'm not saying go and cause trouble, but you can totally do it.
That's really interesting.
And I think it's about, local authorities, unfortunately, I don't think they don't always go out of their way to operate unlawful policies, but I think, you don't if it's not allowing you to upload your evidence, if it's not allowing you to put down the information you need to get across about your child, do a letter, do it your way. I don't think you have to, you don't necessarily have to follow the option that the local authority is prescribing. And I don't think they can reject a letter requesting an EHC needs assessment under the Children and Families Act. I don't think it gives them that option.
That is really
Sorry.
interesting. I've no,
Interesting.
that's great, because I've only ever dealt with online portals that thankfully did align very
really?
closely. Yeah. So I haven't come across one that's been, but you're 100% right. If you
some
do
dodgy
have a local
ones.
authority, yeah, I bet you have. But yeah, if there are some that are unlawful, it's exactly like I said, the law does not say that you've got to do it in a certain way. It just says you've got to make the request to the local authority. So that'll be step
That's
one of the process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
that's
then,
We've
so
got our minds working now, Esther.
yeah, because like you said, the law doesn't actually state how you've got to do it. You've just got to request it. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, and that request does kick off the whole process. So from submitting that request to the local authority has 6 weeks to make a decision about whether it's going to carry out a needs assessment or not. And it needs to communicate that decision to the parents in writing within that 6-week period. And if you find yourself being rejected at that stage, you have a right to appeal that decision to the tribunal. If the local authority agrees to carry out an EHC needs assessment, then the next step will be that assessment takes place. And there is as Esther pointed to earlier, there's a list in the Code of Practice that gives a bit of an idea about the kind of information that local authorities are expected to gather as part of that process. It should certainly involve getting input from an educational psychologist who would go out and assess the child, normally in the school setting, and provide a report on what they observe this child's special educational needs to be, if any, and what provision or support they would recommend be put in place to meet those needs. But depending on the child's profile, it might be appropriate for the local authority to gather other evidence from like an occupational therapist or a speech and language therapist, a physiotherapist, a neuropsychologist. It can be any kind of professional as long as it's relevant to this child's profile and their needs. They'll also be reaching out to the school if the school hasn't already been involved in the request for the needs assessment. Even if they have been involved, they might well end up being contacted by the local authority to provide more information as well to support the assessment. And it will involve reaching out to health and social care services to see whether the child is already known to those services, and if so, whether they've carried out their own social care assessments or health assessments, so that all of that information can be fed into the process. Now, that process can take some time, and one of the big barriers we see is that local authorities take an inordinate amount of time to go through that assessment process. The law says that if a local authority, having carried out that process, decides it's not going to issue an EHCP for the child or young person, they must communicate that decision to parents within 16 weeks of the initial request for an EHC needs assessment. So that's that sort of firm legal deadline, which essentially means that if you've got a local authority that uses their full 6-week period to decide whether they're going to do the assessment or not, that local authority has 10 weeks to gather all the information and then make its decision about whether it's going to issue an EHCP. So week 6 for decision 1, week 16 for decision 2. If a local authority is going to issue an EHCP, then they don't just issue a plan out of the bat. They've got to issue a draft plan first. So they'll draft up a version of the EHCP and send that over to the child's parents for them to have a look through. Now, it's really important that this draft EHCP leaves section I of the plan blank. Section I is where a school placement should be named if this child is attending a school setting. The idea is that's got to be left blank, because the decision about which school the child goes to should be informed by what support and provision the child needs to have in place, rather than the other way round. So you shouldn't be seeing EHCPs where the contents of section F, which is where all of the special educational provision that a child's going to receive is set out, the contents of that section shouldn't be informed by what a chosen school can offer or what it can provide. It's always got to be informed the other way around. So you think first about what the child requires and then think about what setting might be able to deliver that for them. So that's why draft EHCPs have to leave section I blank. But on receipt of that draft EHCP, parents have a period of 15 days at minimum to review the document and return their comments to the local authority. And those comments can be very specific. Esther, have you seen any sort of particular comments that have been raised by parents about draft EHCPs before? I've certainly been very specific in some of the responses I've helped parents draft in the past.
I think what you tend to see is there's a risk that the wording isn't very specific that's used by the local authorities, and so what we advise parents to say is to make sure that you've got the specificity that's required by the Code of Practice, by the Children and Families Act. You really don't want there to be any kind of element of doubt about what is intended in terms of provision. So I think that is vital, and so yeah, I would ask parents to be very specific about any kind of changes they want and to back it up with any kind of evidence. It was interesting hearing you talk about the assessment process, just in terms of I've just been through it recently on a personal level, done it obviously many times for clients and their children. You also have an assessment, although you have the education psychology assessment, you have a paediatric assessment, usually by the designated medical officer for the local authority, and also social care will review the paperwork and screen whether they think there's any sort of unmet social care needs as well. However, in my daughter's case, I ended up with a final EHCP before I'd had the kind of assessment from the paediatrician or social care had given their tuppence worth. So that is really common, and so it doesn't all kind of doesn't quite connect together perfectly like it should, but hopefully it does eventually come. Some people never get those bits, so I felt like I was winning, that I'd actually that those had indeed happened, albeit afterwards. So yeah, just to give you a flavour of there's what's meant to happen, and then there's the reality.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And one of the things that can offer that is that, so the last sort of strict legal deadline in this process says that a final EHCP that's issued for a child or young person must be issued within 20 weeks of the initial request for a needs assessment. So where we talked about 6 weeks for the local authority to decide whether to assess, 16 weeks if it's going to not issue a plan, that final EHCP should be issued within 20 weeks of the very beginning of the process, if there's going to be a final plan issued for the child. And that 20-week deadline can send some local authorities into a bit of a tizzy. And I suspect, Esther, do correct me if I'm wrong, that part of the problem might have been that they hadn't received that input within that 20-week period, had a slight panic about, oh gosh, well, do we issue a plan without that information, or do we not issue a plan within the statutory timeframe that we're meant to? Some local authorities will err one way, others will err the other, but it can cause a lot of palaver if you find that actually that it just logistically it's taking longer to gather the information as part of that assessment process than the entire process is legally meant to take.
I think it's one of the biggest problems with the EHC needs assessment process is delay, and all local authorities have targets around processing their EHCPs within the statutory 20-week deadlines. I think they're probably at the worst level they've ever been, but I think Lauren's absolutely right. In order to try and make sure that they're getting the EHCP finalised, sometimes they do it ahead, and they might do it before the school consultation process is finished. So you might just get a final EHCP that names a type of school, like mainstream or specialist, whilst the consultation process is continuing. that can be good and bad. It can be good in terms of that you get a potentially final enforceable EHCP. We talked earlier about it being a legal document and that your child could potentially be entitled to the provision. The bad side of it is that actually the EHCP you've got could potentially not be very useful if it doesn't name a school yet. If your child was out of school, for instance, and the local authorities off the hook, so to speak, in terms of their statutory deadline, there's just, I think, the risks are snarling up in the process, delay, and that's what we see, parents coming to us where there's been a breach of that statutory deadline, and we can use legal remedies such as judicial review to move things along. Normally, just an email either indicating you're going to make a formal complaint or that you're going to instruct a lawyer to bring a judicial review. That will get things moving if the kind of the assessment process is delayed or one of those you've stalled, in any one of those areas. A big problem that has been, I think it's still affecting people, I don't know what you think, Lauren, is the shortage of education psychologists. That's been nationwide issue, and it certainly makes it harder for local authorities to stick to their statutory deadlines.
Absolutely. I think I've lost count of the number of local authorities that have turned around and said, in correspondence that I've seen, look, we appreciate the law says we've got to do this within a certain amount of time, but we just do not have educational psychologists available to come out and do the assessment in that time frame. I've seen some local authorities take a bit more of a proactive approach to trying to fix that problem. I know of a couple, certainly, who have a policy now where they will provide either full or partial reimbursement to parents for the costs of privately instructing an independent EP to undertake that assessment, because they just know the statutory services are so overwhelmed. That's certainly not every local authority's approach, but if you do find that that's the barrier you're coming up against, if you'll send, contact in the local authority's team, it's telling you, look, it's just a shortage of experts, there's not a lot we can do, I would suggest looking into whether they have a policy like that in place. And if they don't, I think Esther's 100% right. A formal complaint as a first step. And yeah, just know there are potential legal remedies available if you do find local authorities just blatantly ignoring these timeframes that are set out clearly in law.
Thank you for going through that, guys. Just quickly, is there any sort of evidence or information that can strengthen this request for an assessment?
Absolutely. So I suppose if we, Lauren and I say this all the time to our clients, if you could afford one piece of evidence to get yourself as a parent, I would say get your own education psychology assessment. If you're not sure what's going on with your child, that's really going to help you find out. It's going to flag up any other kind of potential assessments that might be required, and it can get things moving. And I think if you get a really robust education psychology assessment, they're going to be able to comment as well whether they think your child requires an EHC needs assessment or whether their SEND provision can be met from within a school's usual resources. So I'd say that is probably the gold star standard in terms of what evidence is the most useful. But also, if your child's already receiving sort of speech and language therapy, OT, physio, any of those, get a short report that evidences what provision they're having, what are their needs. That would be useful. I always say to parents, if their child's SEN is impacting on their behaviour in school, whether it's attendance or whether it's challenging behaviour or having kind of shutdowns, at school, then the CPOMS records from school can be really useful evidence for this. I'm not suggesting parents go making repeated SARS or subject access requests for their child's data to schools. Don't annoy your school. But a timely subject access request, you don't have to put it in as a subject access request. You can just say, please, can I have a copy of the CPOMS is the system most schools use to record behaviour data, and say, I want to use this as evidence towards the EHC needs application, especially if for instance, that maybe they're having some fixed term exclusions, or that the behaviour is being documented appropriately. it can be quite revelatory and really, solid contemporaneous evidence. So I would definitely recommend that. Evidence around their attendance as well. If your child's struggling to attend school, that you don't really get much better evidence on unmet need than that, I would say. So that is really useful. And I think, any kind of GP or medical evidence that might be impacting on this, then if you've got diagnostic sort of neurodevelopmental reports, confirming ADHD or autism, they are really useful as well. Try and keep the documentation recent. I think that's another key tip. Having stuff that's 5-10 years old is not very useful. We need to know about now, and I would say probably 2-3 years is the maximum. Obviously, it depends how old your child is. If they're only 3 years old, there's as recent as possible. But if they're 20 and a young person, having a 10-year-old report is not very helpful. So I think those are the key documents that spring to mind for me. School reports, that's really good as well, isn't it? School reports, any kind of, like, if there's interesting correspondence with school. I already mentioned sort of exclusions. If your child's been permanently excluded or has sort of fixed term exclusion, suspensions, that sort of documentation and the reasons behind that are really useful. A supportive letter from the school is very helpful. I did some slightly interesting niche things for my daughter's EHC needs application. I got, I think I had something from her, or maybe it was for her education psychology assessment, but I had something from her piano teacher and also from her ballet class in terms of looking at how she behaves and
Yeah, so looking at the clubs from outside as well, and then
it's
giving
not
a holistic view.
Yeah, you wouldn't necessarily automatically think of that, but I know that we'd had to make reasonable adjustments for her so she could manage those clubs. And just, again, it's just having not just the parent view, but third party views, the teacher's view, the club leader's views. Yeah, really, I think as much variety of evidence as possible. I think, have I forgotten anything, Lauren? Is there anything you can think of?
No, I don't think so. I think the documents that I've found particularly helpful are where you have had children go through that assess plan, do review cycle, and they have some sort of like send support plan that the school have already put in place. That can be really helpful, and showing, I've often found, like, older iterations of those plans to show how over time it's been updated, additional support's been put in place. That obviously didn't work, so then had to try more support in place instead. That's a really helpful way of really clearly evidencing what the school's already tried to do to meet these needs that evidently isn't working. And it ties really nicely to the legal test as well, so it can be really high quality evidence. But yeah, I think Esther's hit the nail on the head. Like, it can be you can get creative in terms of what evidence will be helpful, but always bear in mind the legal test, because that's what you're ultimately trying to prove here. You're trying to show that this child may have special educational needs. So anything that might help evidence where they're struggling will be helpful there. And that they may require support over and above what a standard mainstream school could provide from its own resources. So it's like Esther says, where you've got a ballet club where you've already had to make some kind of reasonable adjustment, that is evidence to show what kind of support is already having to be put in place. And if this child is still struggling, then that really closely aligns with the test the local authority are meant to be applying when they consider these assessments. So yeah, I don't think there's any more documents that I would suggest as standard would be good to include. But it's all case by case basis. It's all based on the child's specific circumstances.
I thought of one more thing that I would probably recommend is test results are really useful as well. For instance, there's regular kind of, SATs that kids have to do, whether it's there's phonics screening, there's times table tests that they do in year 4, and then there's the year 6 SATs are really quite helpful. And then the other tip I would give is that if you don't have documentary evidence, you can ask for school to do some tests. So if you have concerns, I think a lot of schools can do their own dyslexia screening, and I think that's a really useful way of flagging up difficulties with a child from the get-go. For instance, although if your child, my daughter, for instance, came out as quite low risk for dyslexia when she had hers in year 3, but it already started spotting some of her difficulties with her working memory and executive functioning, which then, of course, down the line became quite important areas of SEND for her when she did get her diagnostic sort of tests and assessments. But it meant that we could feed that into her assess, plan, do, review earlier on and be thinking about actually she might need extra time for testing because of those areas. Also, schools have link EPs. If your child is really struggling in school, ask your school if they can use any of their credits to get early EP assessment, because you could get an earlier EP intervention through your school. It's not always possible. You might have to join a long queue, but that might be a way of doing it if you can't afford to get it before the EHC needs assessment, and getting an EP assessment that way. So I think those are just a couple more tips, and hopefully that's given you a wide variety of evidence to go for.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. I think it's really important information that people need, because like you said, there's so many different areas that you can get evidence from, and you don't just need something like you said, you can pull it all together from lots of different places. So yeah, I think that's really, really helpful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for this first episode, but we are going to record another episode. So the next episode we're going to record is all about sort of annual reviews, tribunals, appeals, that sort of thing. So we're going to dive even deeper into EHC needs assessment. So thank you both so much. Is there anything that you want to sort of leave on when it comes to sort of the assessment process bit?
I think the one thing I would say, the nugget of information that I wish every parent would understand, is that if you gather your own evidence from, say, a private EP, and the local authority turns around and says to you, we won't consider this because it's come from a private EP, we're flat out refusing, just know that if the tribunal were to have a look at this same question, if you were to end up appealing the local authority's decision, the tribunal will not take that approach, and it will likely not take kindly to the local authority ignoring very clear expert evidence that is directly relevant to the case in question. So have confidence that if you're gathering this information, it should be being considered.
Wow. Yeah.
That's a very powerful thing to end on there, Lauren.
Yeah, I was going to say
I was trying to move it in earlier, and I just thought it's something that so many parents come up to me and say. They say, oh, we've spent all this money on a private EP, and the local authority just turned around and said, well, we're not looking at it. And it just, it makes me frustrated on their behalf.
Yeah, I've had parents in coming into BIBIC for assessments, and they've spoken about having all these private assessments and not taking it into account. So that is very interesting. Yeah,
I don't know what to say to that one, because I've had the same where they've had it refused, and therefore they don't know what to do because that evidence that they've collected has been refused. But actually, mind blown.
Yeah. I can't wait to hear about the next bit, guys. Thank you so much for coming on and talking us through the process. And yeah, catch the next episode where we delve even deeper. Thanks for tuning in to The Sensational Life with BIBIC. We hope you're leaving with new insights, fresh ideas, and a bit more inspiration than when you press play.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow or subscribe. And if you have a moment, leave us a review. It really helps us reach more listeners and grow this amazing community.
If you've got a question, a story to share, or a topic you'd love us to cover, we'd love to hear from you. Email us at thesensationallife@bibic.org.uk.
And don't forget to come over and say hello on social media. Follow BIBIC to stay up to date with episodes, extras, and maybe some behind the scenes bits.
Until next time, keep it sensational.